All right. Well, it's Sunday morning here. Good morning to our Grail Country viewers, and we've got James. And I say your last name, Cortides, right?
Yep, that's right.
All right. And James you popped in on a couple of Grail Country videos, I believe. But today, what James and I wanted to talk about came out of just a comment in one of the videos that I think it was Sherry and myself, and maybe somebody else was in, is just the concept of mental health and spiritual warfare. And both James and I deal with mental health issues, and obviously we'll be able to kind of speak to maybe some of our perspectives that we've come to on spiritual warfare, and where those two things meet. Right. So what I'd like to do, just to give you a little bit of a broader introduction to the Grail audience, because I know you've been in on a couple of videos, James, just like maybe just a brief sketch of just kind of where you are landing within your own spiritual and religious tradition, and why maybe this topic is of interest to you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I've been looking forward to talking with you. I think I first came across you in doing the work on the apocalypse and a lot of writings there. So that's what piqued my interest. So I'm glad we're able to connect here. So my background, quickly is I was born. Parents moved here from Greece, Greek Orthodox, went to church early with my grandma, and then stopped going at about 12, 13 years old. And then got really, had a tough kind of high school situation that happened. That's where I really got into the drugs and the alcohol and the partying really hard. And, spent the last few years of my 20s kind of untangling from that. And I'm still trying to untangle from that. But about 5 years ago, I found the church fathers, and I started looking into orthodoxy. I have a background in philosophy and continental philosophy and psychoanalysis. Then I came across the church fathers after, Jordan Peterson came out with his biblical series, and I found Jonathan Peugeot. And so long story short, about 2 years ago, I was able to baptize all three of my kids back into the Orthodox Church, started attending services again. My channel, I explore a lot of the people, ideas, and cultures that are kind of engaging with Orthodox anthropology, and then more kind of secular, philosophical, psychoanalytic information, and just kind of exploring. That's kind of what I do. So I'm still working through my my Orthodox faith, what that means, and it's kind of what brought me here.
Fantastic. Yeah. And so just as like the broad opening question, we'll kind of explore probably a bunch of different things, but in that kind of connection point between mental illness and spiritual warfare, my first question would be like, as someone who experiences that, and I do too, like, I mean, how do you understand maybe a broad sense of like, how do you understand that phenomenon? And then and how that affects people, and maybe how does that maybe transect with ideas of spiritual warfare?
Yeah, for sure. I think you're familiar with the concept of fifth generational warfare or informational warfare. The idea is that there's no distinction between soldier and citizen, and we're all kind of fraught with and inundated with information at hyper speed all the time, without the real capacity to digest and make sense of what's coming at us. And it's just like drinking from a fire hose. And in doing that, our capacity to understand and to make sense of the world is fractured. And I think that from a mental health perspective, I think it's ubiquitous at different levels and different intensities, depending on someone's situation. But of course, from a more secular perspective, or kind of where these ideas intersect, right? The psyche is a term. It's a Greek term. It means the soul, right? So psychology is the phenomenology of the soul, or the logos of the soul. So the mind is a spiritual capacity. The mind is a spiritual product, and we pay a lot of attention to the food that we eat, that we put into our stomach, but we don't see it similarly about taking information into our mind, right? And there is polluted information, the informational landscape is so completely polluted that it's something we need to pay attention to, especially with all these digital screens that have seemed to have surrounded us, right? So I think that the digital world is a tool that it's a double-edged sword, right? Like any other technology. But I think the inundation of information from all angles all the time is necessarily going to fracture the mind, and the mind is the purview of the soul. So I think that's kind of where they intersect.
Interesting. So I'm going to ask kind of, I hope that, Grail Country folks will indulge me on this one, because you already brought up something that I wanted to address within this kind of broader constellation of issues. One of the areas, so I go into one of the primary spiritual experiences that I had was, kind of in a manic trance. Like there was mental illness issues all over this. So I'm not going to deny that, but there was something profoundly spiritual at play. And one of the things that I had a sense of in this experience was just the presence of logos in all things, like the ubiquity of Christ's presence. And there's a fundamental logic underneath, all experience and all phenomena that there's this binding agency within reality. Right. And so and reality is either functioning in coherence with that logos or distorting that logos, kind of one of the two things. So one of the areas, I love to explore science a lot, not because I'm a scientist, but just kind of, I like the concepts. And one of the concepts that I've found deeply resonant with that is the idea of information theory, right? That essentially all physical phenomenon, and I would say even psychic or psychological phenomenon, is reducible to some kind of information state at the physical level, that there's a information component to that. And you've got, like you said, good information and bad information. And so Paul's text in Romans 12 talking about being transformed according to the renewal of the mind and not being conformed to this age, right? Kind of filters into that. How do you see the mind functioning as we process information? And I very much, I see that, both at the spiritual warfare level, at the mental health warfare or mental health struggle, is you're constantly having to process information and weed out the distorted information that comes through, the difficult elements of mental illness, right? If you're depressed, it will definitely color how you're processing information. So how does that maybe connect, the idea of just bare information and then our ability to process that information and make discerning choices between what is moving us further in our union with God, further in our union with Christ, and then the kinds that are maybe taking us further away from that?
Yeah, no, I think that's the question. And it's interesting you framed it like that, because I had this quote from Father Seraphim Rose here that I wanted to share. He says, "The psychological trials of dwellers in the last times will be equal to the physical trials of the martyrs. In order to face these trials, we must be living in a different world." That's the quote. So we hear all these stories of the martyrs who were tortured, hands cut off, tongues cut off, sent to the lions, quite literally. And Father Seraphim Rose was saying that the psychological trials of dwellers in the last times of the apocalypse, which just means the revealing, that we're living in a time of revealing right now, however you want to kind of couch that, will be equal to the physical trials of the martyrs. And in order to face these trials, we must be living in a different world. From this perspective, the different world is the church, right? The Orthodox Church, because he was an Orthodox monk. Right. And I think you hit it right on the head with the term discernment. And I wrote it down as you were describing your question. So how do you develop discernment, and how do you know if that discernment is helping you or hindering you? From my experience, the more that I've been re-engaging with kind of Orthodox faith and reading the fathers and praying and being present with my family and kind of the local environment around me, I find that I've been able to make sense of the world, as we've gone through COVID and trying to anticipate what to do and what's going to happen. And, you can retroactively look, did your prediction of what we should do as a family, or how we should react, did it bear out in the results, right? So it's almost like discernment is almost like this algorithm in your mind and your heart that predicts what's going on, so you can prepare and then make sense of the word, and then of the world, and then help others make sense of the world in a kind of reciprocal fashion, right? Developing a network of people that you trust, people that you've come across in person and in the digital space, and that building a network like that develops inherently resilience within you and the others. And it's a wonderful thing, because you can look back, was my prediction correct? Was it accurate in terms of what happened? And then you're kind of on the right path, and you can follow that path. And you got to continuously look back to see if that algorithm is working appropriately. And what helps that algorithm, again, for me, was prayer, fasting, and developing really kind of these spiritual practices that are inherent in the Orthodox faith that my family comes from. Right. So I found a lot of solace in that, but
Yeah.
you're still feeling the slings and the arrows of this informational warfare, right? The term information means in formation, right? It builds a body. It's corporeal, right? It informs.
Yeah.
So if something is if something is building your body, right? If you're aiming appropriately, which for me would be my Orthodox faith, it's my body is being built by the information that I'm taking in. But the misinformation or disinformation causes the opposite. It causes a disintegration within the psyche, and then inherently within the relationships that you have. So are the sources of information that you're using and the spiritual tools that you're using, are they making you a better father? Are they helping you with your relationships with your family, your friends, your coworkers? And I've noticed that, over the last few years, that I've been more able to be present, even with someone like at the corner store where I'm getting, a drink or something. You ask them what their name is. Hey, what's your name? And have a conversation with them. So this kind of discernment informs and helps all areas of your life. But it's not one and done, right? It's always, you're on a path and then you fail. You're on your path and you sin, right? You keep missing the mark. And it's having that trust and bringing yourself back towards aiming appropriately. And this is the rudder, I think, that we need to develop here, and is it's difficult, and it's going to be increasingly more difficult. So that's kind of broad outline.
Yeah. So that's an interesting. I'll share a little bit of like the experience of discernment and tying it to some of like what we're talking about here. So the way I kind of see the mind working is almost like, I wouldn't reduce the mind to just this, but just a function of the mind is, in a sense, it's kind of like a radio receiver or a satellite dish that's able to take the ambient information around it and can that kind of those bits of data and like synthesize that into meaningful information, getting on the right bandwidth and translating what's coming in. And then you can create meaning out of that. Right. So I look at the kind of the field of mental activity as kind of a very diverse field of information with all kinds of inputs. Right. So like if we take, watching a YouTube video, that's information that's being generated by a few content generators and maybe some commenters that are kind of working through the material as well. And that's kind of all going into our information processing that we're taking in as individuals. But I would also grant that there are other forces in that information field, right, that are either enhancing the truth factor of the information we're getting or actually giving us malformed information, right? So distorted information, so an information warfare. So sometimes this is maybe where I would get into where I think spiritual entities are probably most at play. Like, I mean, some people might think of spiritual warfare in terms of like possession and something out of like a horror film with lots of Catholic influences. And granting that maybe that phenomenon happens from time to time, I don't think that that's the most common forms of spiritual warfare. I think it's the war for the mind. And there can be multiple kinds of influences where, So like if I'm going through a period where I am depressed or manic as someone who's bipolar, like I have to process my information differently, because it's like, okay, I am depressed, but I still might be getting true information from some of those depressive inputs that make me more empathetic to the suffering that's in the world, but it may not be as bleak as I'm making it, right?
Hmm.
Or when I'm manic and there's some, I'm able to make these great connections and all that kind of stuff, I also might be making connections that aren't completely justifiable or warranted. And then there may be other noise on the line, that is coming through in the form of like maybe intrusive thoughts and those kinds of things. And so what the processing power of the mind, the discerning power of the mind has to come into play to be able to filter through those things and to begin to kind of interrogate your information sources, right? So for example, like in mood regulation, right? So this is one of the things, because I have a mood disorder. I'll be driving home from work, just dealing with the frustrations of the day in and day out of the operation that I'm involved in. And, I'll just be sitting there, God, I'm angry. And like, the relationship I have with the Lord is kind of conversational. He's like, are you angry? I'm like, well, no, I feel anger.
Hmm.
Okay. And so it's like kind of this distancing effect of what the Lord does is he pulls me up and out of the immediacy of the experience to a higher level view where it's like, okay, let's look at this stuff and let's go through it and discern what it is. And usually it's like a feeling that may be valid, but may also be distorting my picture of reality. And so, I mean, I have to go through these kind of exercises on a regular basis because like the mood disorder doesn't go away. So I'm
Hmm.
constantly having to process information in this way. But also having to identify, like there are times where I will feel like there's a spiritual agency behind the information that I'm getting, sometimes very positive. So for example, like in the homily at church this morning, I may be particularly moved in a powerful way because the Spirit is conveying truth to me in the homily, right? Or in the liturgy. And so it's effective and it's transformational. But there may be like an intrusive or a way out there thought that pops into my head. And it's like, well, did that even originate with me? And sometimes my conclusion is that's just one of those fiery arrows that I've got to say, no, that's not from God. And I don't have to respond in any particular way other than to just point out that's not from him, you know?
Hmm.
And so that's kind of how I've had to develop, in terms of just my ability to deal with, the ongoing realities of mental illness, because it won't go away. Um, it puts me in that kind of situation that Paul describes in 2 Corinthians 12, of a kind of thorn in the flesh. This is a thorn in my mind
Hmm.
that makes me very reliant on grace. And for as messy as my life has been at times with the mental illness struggles, it's also pointed me into an understanding that if I don't have a spiritual framework and basis to address these issues with, the picture gets really bleak for me really quick. And so it's forced me into a deeper dependence on God and on God's grace. But, like, where is it I want to say it's in Titus, right? The letter to Titus, like God's grace is also disciplines us, not in an authoritarian way, but it puts us in a position to deal with the issues that are in our life and to grow spiritually in maturity through that. So the grace is what carries me through that struggle. But I have to engage it, because if I don't engage the warfare, which is all mental activity at that point, or spiritual activity at that point. It's not, physical warfare, but you have to engage the field of battle. Like that becomes like vital to, my ability to thrive in life and to press forward with the things that, God's called me to. So, what, for you, like in the way that you kind of have to, navigate your own issues, like what does that look like for you as far as, getting to that place where the mental health issues, you're able to find some spiritual equilibrium and growth through those?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And interesting, I had a similar situation that happened with me in 2015, where I had an awakening. Right, I've been always dealing with anxiety and kind of coping substance abuse, but not really abuse, but being kind of a functional person that takes Adderall. It's always wants to be mentally stimulated. I've gone through that my whole life, and
Yeah.
spent many different attempts of different shrinks or different medications of this, that, and the other, and it didn't work, and things were getting worse. And I found myself in a traditional Chinese medicine shop where I had acupuncture, and during the acupuncture, I had this really intense experience that kind of opened me up, and that was my spiritual awakening, quote unquote spiritual awakening. Cut to about a year later, I started, I started practicing qigong and a lot of neigong, which is a lot of kind of alchemical, traditional Chinese medicine, internal martial arts. Really got into that for a couple of years, which opened me up more to the understanding of the spiritual world and its effect, at least on me. But I almost lost my marriage at that point. I quit my 6-figure job to start a healing business because I figured, oh, if anybody needs to learn meditation and learn these methods, because I want to help people heal themselves. That was my idea. And I thought I was doing it for the betterment of others. And in my head I was, but in reality, I was just being hyper inflated. My spiritual ego was being hyper inflated. And thank God I came out of that. And I came out of that through, I used to do psychedelics. I may or may not have grown them myself and experimented. And I had this experience in 2017, which was the last time I ever touched a psychedelic that really jarred me. We're talking about entities, kind of octopus-like entity coming in and kind of engulfing you in the craziest kind of sounding stuff. But anyways, at that time, I found the psychological significance of the Bible, Jordan Peterson's series, and I started listening to Jonathan Peugeot and getting involved. And he always brought up, people would ask him, what books did you read? Where are you getting this stuff? He says, it's all there in the Fathers. And I would be like, what do you mean the Fathers? What does that even mean? Like, where are you getting this stuff? Like, what's in the Church Fathers? So reluctantly, I finally started looking at the Church Fathers, and I found in the Eastern Orthodox Church Fathers, I found what I was looking for. And I explored Buddhism, Hinduism, traditional Chinese medicine, all of the New Age stuff from, we're ascending into a 5D civilization, and we just need to help wake people up and all that stuff. And then I practiced meditation, and so all the stuff that I was looking for in Eastern religions, I found in the religion of my ancestors in its most purest form, it seemed like to me. So, and in doing so, I was able to kind of orient myself, fix the relationship between me and my wife, and had a couple more kids, got into a job that was more, more in line with kind of where I was going, and things started really began to settle. Right. So, and in the Fathers, they say the most important thing you can do is watch your thoughts, right? Watch your thoughts carefully and attentively, because just like you were saying, you're having this information come in and having the ability to discern. If you stop watching your thoughts, if you give in to the mood that comes upon you, and I have a mood disorder as well, right? And it's a grace is being able to step away and be like, oh, I shouldn't make decisions right now, or I shouldn't necessarily act on the thoughts that I'm having right now because I'm either anxious or depressed or whatever it may be. God's grace is the ability to step away and to observe. And it doesn't work all the time, because sometimes the mood is so powerful, even though you're stepping away and you're able to watch the thoughts and be like, oh, that's not even my thought, you still feel the kind of the adrenaline or the norepinephrine or whatever it is. It's still there. It's like, oh, this just doesn't feel good. And you, in those states, you don't think they're going to go away. It's weird. You're like, oh man, whether you're angry or depressed, like, this is it. This is just the way I am. But they always go away. There's always a shifting in the mood. Right. So the ability of being able to step back and observe the moods as they come and go, and with God's grace, not to act on a certain decision, especially a major life decision like quitting your 6-figure job. Like, so it's a fraught territory. And I think with a lot of people really getting into the New Age stuff and psychedelics and all this stuff, and even meditation, right? Meditation, if you do it to calm yourself and your deep breathing, it's wonderful. But if you start dabbling into the spiritual aspects of meditation, you're really opening yourself up to forces that you don't understand, that you can't really
Mm.
appropriate into your life. And if you do that, too much, you can really lose your grip on reality. But within your own phenomenology, you are gaining a grip on reality. You're becoming enlightened, and you're waking up. So it's a fraught territory that we're all in here. And I think we're all in this space of mental degradation, of mental health degradation. But I don't think it's inherent in each of us. I think it's the state of the fallen world continuing to fracture. And if you're sensitive, I think like I'm sensitive, you can feel that and it affects you, right? But always coming back to prayer and to conversations with Christ, right? The truth is there, and it's there, right? Nothing can change that. And you're going to veer off from the truth many times in many different ways, but there's solace in understanding that there is the logos, there is the truth, and this logos and this truth manifests itself in every encounter that you have. And you can a lot of times retrospectively look to see if you acted appropriately, but there is an appropriate way to act. And I never thought that, because I was a relativist, everything is just a perspective. But no, there is the right thing to do. And you can discern that right thing, right? Did you make your loved one feel good about themselves, right? Did you, were you present? So there are ways and tools that you can use to bring you out of these moods. And a lot of times they come with watching your thoughts. But if you continuously polluting your informational landscape with bad information, all the noise there keeps you from being able to discern. All right. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it's a fraught landscape. It's not easy. And I think I don't know anybody, that doesn't have some sort of challenge with appropriating the world these days,
Well, you brought up so many interesting things, James. Like there's like 4 things I want to, respond to, as a kind of a throwaway aside, on the psychedelic question, right? My experiences have been, I don't use them very often. I think the last time I used them was maybe 3 years ago or something like that. And I've like a handful of times in my life I've used them. It's been very positive. Same with the meditation, but I think my meditation practices have kind of grown out of, the deeper understanding of what meditation is like. We're called to meditate on the word day and night, right? And it's really a speaking again, like to ruminate, or to, like, the literal term is to speak again, or to say over and over again, kind of thing. It's a form of prayer, but it's always the object of meditation is what's in question, right? Because you can definitely, you can have powerful encounters in those realms. But what I found, curiously enough, is that because I've seen people, I've had friends who've got like traumatic brain injuries from military service and that kind of stuff, have been tremendously helped with some of the therapeutic effects of certain psychedelics, that kind of stuff. I don't recommend them to people, it's like, hey, if you're going to do that, use or beware. You're stepping into a world of all kinds of things. But what was interesting is the structure of, like, let's say Maximus or Gregory of Nyssa, or the great theologians. The structure of their thinking is already psychedelic in that sense. Like, you're being brought into those dimensions of thought and being that my encouragement would always be, like, it's always preferable to enter into that through mental, and in this sense, not drawing a distinction between mental and spiritual activity, right? Is the more attuned you are to filtering out the good versus the bad in the informational field, the better off you're going to be. And I can't think of probably anyone better than Maximus on this account, right? He's a towering figure that has explored so much in terms of the mystery of the incarnation, but also just how that touches everything. And is a very helpful guide in terms of, for me, I think I was drawn more into the Fathers out of spiritual practice, but this side of things, so that's kind of throwaway stuff, because I find that somewhat interesting to explore conversations in psychedelics, but it's not something I'm not one of those guys that thinks that you want to you know, people can do what they want, but it's not something I'd particularly recommend, whether it's positive or negative, just simply because if you can access an experience through like reading Maximus the Confessor, you've facilitated actual learning and you've slowed yourself down, and it's more immersive actually. Which
But
is
there's some, it's still like, like if you go straight to Maximus, all right, like there's still a progression that has to happen. Even the
Yeah.
fathers warn against the, the Jesus prayer, which is the cornerstone of the Orthodox faith. It's something that you should say continuously, pray continuously, and then you attach it to the breath, right?
Mhm.
But you don't want to go straight to there, and you should have a spiritual father, just like if you're delving into psychedelics, and you should find someone that is experienced. Set and setting are important. Same thing with these kind of potent spiritual writings of someone like Maximus, right? It's a fraught landscape if you're trying to make sense of these things by yourself without any tradition around it, without any help of a spiritual father. So I used to be, if every CEO would take DMT, then our world would be a better place. And I was an evangelical psychedelic dude, one of those guys that went away quickly. So I have the same pause. I don't recommend for or against them. Just be careful, because the insights that you're getting, like you're saying, you don't know the positive or negative qualities of them until later on, and they might feel really, really positive when you're going through them, but it's only retroactively when you reflect on how did they affect your life, your relationships, that you can really discern that. So I just wanted to drop that in there.
Yeah. What was more interesting to me, and this is kind of in the realm of the experience of like the mood disorder, right? Is like I went through, this time last year, I went through a really difficult episode, probably my most difficult in years. And I remember I was just, in prayer, kind of crying out to the Lord, just like, Lord, when do I stop feeling this way? He just said, Jed, you're going to feel all of it. But I'm with you every step of the way. Right. Is like, I have to open my heart to the fact that like my emotional life and my mood states are going to be in this state of constant flux, and kind of, they are what they are, but they aren't what I am. They aren't who I am rooted in Christ. In Christ, I'm not manic depressive. Whatever my experience here in this life, that manic depressive experience, that's only just a very small fraction of the much larger identity that I have in him. And so it helped me in that time of suffering to realize, the grace that carries you through those experiences, but also picks you up when you've fallen down, it helped me become that observer, become observant, to read my thoughts, to read my emotions, and in that kind of recursive effect is like the center point for me. And I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Father John Bear for his writings and his ministry, is that it's all centers into the fact that creation is happening at the cross. And that is where God is on full display. The full humanity and divinity of God are on display there at the cross. That's the reality that is being kind of planted like a seed into the rest of reality. And so it becomes that resonant place of like, I can go back to the cross all the time, and I can take a thought or a mood or a particular idea or whatever it is, and like, how does that square with what I'm seeing at Calvary, with God who's revealing himself in that place? And it's become an interesting exercise, because it kind of goes into that idea that Paul talks about in Galatians 2:20 about having been I have been crucified with Christ, is going, bringing me to the cross. And that's kind of the center point, the fixed point that I know I can go to, and that is the truth disclosed there never changes. Right. So the mood states can always be fluctuating. I can feel anger, and sometimes the anger, there's a justification behind it. But even if you have justified anger, it doesn't mean you have to act in the way your anger is dictating, right? Or if you're elated over a particular the circumstance that's going well. You don't necessarily need to escalate that into another, another level of, get the party going kind of thing. It helps bring me back to like an alpha point in reality. The R key of all reality is the cross. And I find that for me, like that may sound like esoteric and etheric, but it's like, it's actually fundamental to just practically how I deal with mental illness and the war that goes on for the mind. Is I go to the cross. And then it's like, then what I realize is, you were talking about, like sometimes when you're in those dark places, especially depression, you can feel like it's just going to last forever. But when I go to the cross, I see an end to it there. It's like, I may not feel it right now. Okay, I'm going to probably feel depressed. Like if I'm in a depressive cycle, it could last for a few days, a few weeks, or even a few months. But it's like, okay, this cycle is eventually going to burn itself out. These negative feelings are not always going to be present. There may be some things that I can learn from them while I'm going through them, but I also don't have to allow it to overtake the way I treat people, the way I communicate. It's going to color it a little bit, but that's when I've learned to let people in my life that I'm close to, when I am struggling, say, hey, look, I am kind of struggling right now. And like, just keep an eye on me. Know that like, if something comes out of my mouth that doesn't sound quite right, like, just let me know, like, hey, that's not quite lining up with reality, and I'll work on it, but just give me a little bit. And I find that the people in my life that I am close with and that I love are very accommodating with that. It's been very helpful for me navigating it, but it all goes back to the cross. And because I feel like it's a truth, it's a durable reality that I can count on. And like when everything else is flux and everything else is change, that doesn't change. Because that's actually what changes everything else. But, it's, so I see its transformative effect. And obviously, like the way that plays itself out in reality is a lot of stops and starts and steps forward and steps back. But the trajectory is one of growth. And, and I find that that's, in the realm of experience, like, is there like, demonic type things in that spiritual warfare? I think sometimes people overblow what that is, because I think like, where the human mind has been hijacked is at the level of consciousness itself. There's a fracture in the mind. And so you don't have to even be, possessed by some sort of entity or anything like that. They just have to know how to hit your information centers in the right way. And like, you're going to just respond. Right. So if you are a greedy, power hungry person, all you need is the right carrots and sticks, and your outcomes are going to be very predictable. Right. So it's like the hijacking of the mind, I don't think is like, it's just a distortion of the inputs, so that the way you're interpreting that, the way that you're discerning and then planning and mapping action gets broken. And I feel like the cross, coming back to the cross, is what interrupts that process and reorients you to the true nature of reality. And so for me, that's part of at least how I approach that bigger subject of spiritual warfare. Is like, it's actually like the decisive victory. Like, I go to the point where the victory was already won.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's beautifully said. And I think you kind of said what I was saying, and you brought it to the essence of it, right? We keep missing the mark and we bring ourselves towards the aim again. That aim is the cross. That aim is the cross, right? And the idea to crucify your intellect, that's something that I've been chewing on for quite a while. But this idea of coming back to the cross, I love. And I think what is kind of coming up in our conversation here is, we're not saying it overtly, or we kind of are. How can we gauge if we're hitting the mark? And it always goes back to Christ's 2 commandments, right? Love your neighbor with all your heart, or love God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself. Come back to those two, because it's like, am I doing X, Y, and Z? Well, how is it affecting my relationships? How is it affecting my work life? It always goes back to your relationships with others, with your neighbors. And I think that's one of the most beautiful ways that you can discern if you're on the right path, because it's easy to get spiritually inflated, right, in a negative or a positive way. I think the fathers say that even, looking down on yourself or having these kind of falling into these thought loops where I'm not a good person, I'm not doing X, Y, and Z, that is an ego. You're still focusing on yourself. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. And something that you kind of touched upon. You use the word archy, right? So the truth is the truth, right? It's the lamb slain before the creation of the world, right?
Mhm.
And in John 1, we hear, in the beginning was the word, right? In the Greek translation is στην αρχή ήταν ο λόγος, right? So the word archi or arc means both the apex, but it also means the beginning of the time. It's the top of spatially, it's the top, but it's also temporally, it's the beginning, right? And it says, in the beginning was the word. What do you mean by word? What, a language? Like what, there's a single word that existed? So using the word logos, in archi was the logos, in the beginning was the truth. In the beginning was the fundamental organizing principle of reality that never leaves and was always there. So, and that is ultimately culminates in the cross, right? So I love the idea of coming back to the cross and orienting yourself. I mean, it's even in a kind of practical way. If you have a target, what marks the target, right? X marks the target, right? That is the target, and developing the discernment to keep coming back. And I think that's where grace comes in. And again, it's like a tuning. I think the mind is more of a receiver, but it's also a creator and a generator. So it's both and, right? It receives information, it appropriates that information, and it spits it back out, right? And that is an algorithm is just a term that we can use currently because it's relevant. But the algorithm is the mind's kind of ability to make sense of the world, which is again evidenced by your relationships. And just a corny saying that I've heard, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn how to surf.
Yep.
Right. You can't. And I think that's right. And I wanted to ask you something that stood out. You talked about kind of identity and being incorporated into a larger identity. And I think what's coming out in our conversation as well is there's an inherent and intrinsic relationship between worship and identity. Right? Your identity is comprised of the things that you hold most dear. And if that's money, sex, or reputation, or whatever it may be, right, will eventually disintegrate things in your life. But if you're worshiping appropriately, and I don't think human beings have a choice but to worship. Birds chirp, dogs bark, human beings worship. And it doesn't just mean when you think of worship of, going on your knees and praying, that's obviously part of it, but it's what is it that you identify with the most, that thing, and it's usually done in an unconscious way. That thing will color your understanding and your perception of the world. So you better be mindful of what you are putting at the top of the hierarchy and what you're worshiping. And it seems to me that anything else other than Christ, right, which from someone it's going to mean, what do you mean? There's all these religions, it has to be Christ. It doesn't. I think Christ is the fullness of the truth. That doesn't mean that someone is a devout Hindu or someone is a devout what have you. Doesn't mean that they can't find that same solace in putting that in the highest, right? So I can't judge someone else for whatever they're doing. Me, it's been Christ, and I can tell that, it's been something that's been elucidated. So what are your thoughts on this idea of the relationship between worship and identity?
Yeah, that's like it's foundational. And it can be a challenge especially within a pluralistic context. And I'm somebody who's more friendly to pluralism. I think that there's a value in it, and a value in difference. But speaking from my own Christian particularity, like I said, is like the worship is what attunes our hearts to the things that endure, right? And it orients, like, whether that's through acts of devotion, participating in the liturgy, or through devotional readings, or through prayer, or through meditation, or the rosary, or the Jesus prayer. There's just such a broad proliferation of Christian practices that fall into that kind of sense of what worship is. But at the center, it's being radically oriented to the real and understanding its primacy, right? Is like, I don't think that God is like asking like some sort of slavish devotion on our part to feed his own lacking ego, right? Which is kind of how praise works among peers, you know, like we're looking for status and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that that's how God is looking at it. Is simply in his offering of himself to us, what he's inviting us into is the fundamental structure of how things actually work, the way things actually are, an economy of grace. And our world is so ungracious that we get warped in our perceptions. And so to be able to go into that source and understand that that is like how that roots into identity, is that too is our source. That's where we come from. Right. And so you're oriented to that simple, you know, and in Christian terms, like that Trinitarian dance of reality that comprises the whole and is disclosed to us at the cross, and that instructs us in like the kind of people that we are to become, what our birthright is. And so that's where I'm very, you know, I've learned to have, I would say, kind of a healthy sense of disassociation, right? In the mental health arena, like, yeah, I have bipolar disorder. I am not bipolar, right? That is not like my alpha identity in Christ. Like it's just it's a phenomenological, it's an experiential thing. Like I have it, right? Just like somebody who has diabetes is not like, you know, that is not the determining factor in their ontological identity. You know, it's like those are accidental in a sense. You know, it's like, is to not over identify really. And I think that's where, you know, Paul in Romans 12 is talking about, you know, not being conformed to this age or to this world, right? Is there's a system at play here that really ultimately does demand conformity to a flawed system that is somewhat, like, if you want to use Hindu terms, somewhat illusory, right? And so you're conforming to an illusion that isn't really totally real either. So being conformed to, you know, having the mind renewed and transformed according to the true nature of reality. I see that's what Jesus is saying to us. Like, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, is like the new paradigm is here. It's the original paradigm. It's new to us. It's not new to God. Hi there. You know, so it's like I see that identity making is happening in worship, right? Which is why, you know, even as a guy, you know, relatively progressive like me, like I still see like tremendous value and importance in the ancient liturgies and in the broad tradition itself. Is it becomes a stable place where you're learning together with your brothers and sisters, not only who are present in that moment, but with the saints and the angels. And so with this continuous communion with the community that spans history itself. So I see that as like very much tied to identity formation is really vital. And if you're kind of in a position where you're constantly just trying to figure this stuff out on your own, what you're robbing yourself of is the communion of the saints, which brings additional inputs in and additional perspective, and allows you to grow and glean learning from the experience of others that you just necessarily are never going to have.
Yeah, it always goes back to communion, right? It goes back to communion in the cross, whether it's communion with the saints or your neighbors or your family, and always coming back to the cross, the point of life, the beginning and the end, which is quite wonderful. And unfortunately, I have to pop off here, but I think we barely scratched the surface. I really wanted to get into maybe we can do a part 2 where we talk about the nature of the passions, the passions like bipolar disorder or addiction or whatever it is. That's where the grace is. It's on the other side of that. The thorn is where the work needs to be done, in a sense. And the passions are those forces that we are passive against, right? That we don't have control over. And everybody has their, I think, unique flavor of passions that they're dealing with. And it seems to be that thing that is we're afflicted with the most is our pathway towards repentance and reorientation. But yeah, I'd like to do a part 2 here. I know we talked a little bit before, so we had a we spent some time before we started recording. But if you're interested, I'd love to do a part 2.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Sherry wanted to join. She's probably would have some really interesting things to add. So we could definitely set that up here in the near future. I think it's a pretty relevant topic, because I think mental health issues are much broader, even within our Christian communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I know from where I came from, that was not those were not things that were, any kind of mental health treatment or was looked at with such suspicion. It was kind of hard to know, okay, well, how do you deal with it when you got the real symptoms, you're dealing with this thing, like, how do you
Mm-hmm.
deal with it? So I think it would be great to focus in on those passions. I'd be interesting to kind of get some of your perspectives, like as someone who kind of has a background in psychoanalysis. I might want to bring in some of the stuff that I've read in Evagrius, which is very interesting on that. So we can definitely do that. And James, thanks for taking some time to discuss, and we'll definitely pick up here, Lord willing, again here in the near future.
Yeah, thank you. It was there's more to say here, but I appreciate kind of this first go, and we've got a lot more to talk about. So I'm looking forward to bringing Sherry on. She's always got her presence, something about her presence and what she offers is wonderful. So I look forward to it.
Absolutely. All right.
Thank you, man.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you. Until next time.
Yes. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, bye.
All right.